Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Dr. Philip Payne. We're going to be talking about 1 Corinthians 34 to 35, which many people have argued that women should be silent in the church. What does Dr. Payne think about this? We're going to talk about a number of different texts and how this relates to women in ministry. How are you doing today, Dr. Payne?
Fine, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Zach.
Awesome. Absolute pleasure. Okay, so can you just give a short summary of your view, what the main evidence is, just, general overview of what we will be talking about?
When I first studied this passage, I assumed that it was by Paul, but I struggled to find an interpretation that fit in the context. In fact, I publicly defended a variety of different interpretations and eventually concluded that no first century reader would have understood it the way I was interpreting it.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, but then one day I thought I had a solution. I thought, if you take the middle of verse 33 and instead of including it with verse 33, if you connect it with verse 34, then as in all the churches of the saints might be interpreted as in accordance with the customs in all the churches of the saints.
Hmm.
And if you do that, then the let women be silent in the churches is no longer an absolute command, but it's qualified by in accordance with the customs in the churches, let the women be silent in the churches. So I decided I'm going to look, hoping I can find evidence from the manuscripts that 33b is actually part of verse 40.
Hmm.
But every manuscript I looked at gave me no help for that solution. In fact, many of the manuscripts have 34 and 35 as a separate paragraph, separated from verse 33.
Hmm.
And in fact, the text that you have up on screen right now
Hmm.
treats 33b as part of the sentence in verse 34. There's actually no manuscript in Greek that does that. They almost all keep 33b as part of 33a.
Hmm.
I later found that a dissertation was published in Latvia going through examining far more manuscripts than I had examined and concluding that there is no manuscript evidence for 33b having been understood as part of 34. So even though uh, I thought I had a way to get around it, the manuscript evidence showed that this is not how any scribe ever understood it.
Hmm.
So, in addition to that problem, I realized that although logically that could qualify the immediately following let women be silent in the churches, it doesn't as logically follow to permit the two later similar prohibitions, uh, for they are not permitted to speak, and especially at the end of verse 35, because it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. That's a long way away for that qualifier to carry over. Uh, so, well, in addition to those problems, we end up with an awkward redundancy, which is very different than Paul's typical concise style. As in all the churches of the saints, the women should be silent in the churches. You don't need to repeat it in the churches if it's all one sentence.
Hmm.
But more important, in terms of Paul's argument, if we divorce 33b from 33a, Paul loses a key element in his argument because he's arguing that the church in Corinth should be worshiping in accordance with what God desires. And he says, God is a God of peace, as in all the churches of the saints. This is the experience of peaceful worship and your worship is not peaceful. So it
Hmm.
needs to be brought in line with that. But if you divorce that from "for God is a God of peace," you take away the specific application of that principle that was needed there in the church in Corinth. So eventually I realized I have not found a good solution. But in the process of looking at all these manuscripts, I found a whole bunch of manuscripts that indicate that those verses were not originally in Paul's letter.
Hmm.
And so I began to consider the manuscript evidence, whether those verses were originally in the text. And I discovered that probably the closest analogy where you have a statement that appears to contradict what we know about the author is in Josephus. In Josephus, there's a famous passage called the Testimonium Flavium. It's where Josephus says, Jesus is the Christ. The problem is that Origen said Josephus did not believe that Jesus was the Christ. And so why would Josephus say this and write this if he didn't believe it? And as far as I know, there is no scholar who believes that Josephus wrote that. But it's in all the manuscripts that we have of that passage. But it doesn't matter because it's incompatible with what we know about Josephus. Therefore, no scholar regards it, that I've ever heard of, regards it as actually a statement by Josephus. So similarly here, we have in the middle of a whole series of I desire all to prophesy. Both before and after these verses, we have this statement, let women be silent in the churches. And then repeated 3 times for emphasis, for they are not permitted to speak, for it is disgraceful for women to speak in church. When you repeat things 3 times in Greek, that's a way of emphasizing that it is absolute. This is a statement that you can run with just as it is. So then I began to look at the manuscript evidence. And in particular, I found that the oldest Bible in Greek, Codex Vaticanus, written about 325 to 350 AD, has a mark in the margin that occurs 15 times in Vaticanus with a gap on that line. And in every case, precisely at the gap on the line, there are manuscripts that are survived that include at least 4 consecutive words that are widely regarded as a spurious later addition. And here we have the same pattern, the symbol in the margin, the gap on the line, precisely where those words interrupt the original text. So the bottom, by the way, this also explains why the entire Western manuscript tradition, all the Greek manuscripts known as Western Greek manuscripts, have these verses not after verse 33, but after verse 40. And we will get into the principles of textual criticism later, but to summarize it very briefly, the text that most easily explains all the other texts is probably the original text. And in this case, if the text was originally in the margin, scribes would have copied it into the text. It was conventional for marginal text to be copied into the main text. They would insert it where they felt it fit best in the adjacent text. And there are only 2 places in the adjacent text where it could logically fit. One is after verse 33, one is after verse 40. So if it were originally in the margin, then you can understand that scribes would put it in the text. In addition to this manuscript, I found 10 other manuscript evidences against it being originally in the text. and 11 evidence in the actual wording in the text that indicate that this would not be something that Paul wrote. We'll get back to those later. That's the big picture.
Awesome. All right. And so people are just have an idea. The two little dots that you can see right here, right there,
Yes.
right
Yes.
there. And then you've got little space over here,
Yes.
and you're saying that is an indication that we can see in other places. And you said Vaticanus, where the scribe was basically saying, "Hey, this was added." That's your argument, correct?
Correct.
All right. But you would also argue that even if it wasn't added, that you still don't necessarily think that this means that all women should be silent in church. Is that right?
Correct. One has to have an interpretation that makes sense. If you interpret an author in a way that is self-contradictory, you're not being fair to the author.
Mm-hmm.
We have to assume that Paul was making sense.
Right. And we'll get to that later as well. All right. So the specific verse in question here, let's see if I can throw that back on the screen. So 34 and 35, the women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak. Rather, let them be in submission, as in fact the law says. If they want to find out about something, they should ask their husbands at home, because it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in church. So that is the question. Are these in the text? And if they are, or the original text, the inspired text, what does that mean for us today? All right. So before we get into like the main evidences for your view, can you give my audience a general survey of the main views, how people approach this text?
Yes. The most common way the text is interpreted is to regard it as a prohibition of women speaking in church. This is the way it's referred to in most of the church fathers. It's the obvious meaning, a simple reading of the Greek text.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Origen writes, even if she speaks marvelous and holy things, it is shameful for a woman to speak in church simply because it comes from the mouth of a woman. For a woman to speak forth in church brings her under shame and the condemnation of the whole church. Tertullian writes, for how credible would it seem that he who is not permitted a woman even to learn with overboldness should give a female the power of teaching and of baptizing. Let them be silent, he says, and at home consult their husbands. Now, interesting, Tertullian later states that Paul is enjoining on women silence in the church, that they speak not for the mere sake of learning. And then he puts in parentheses, although that even they have the right to prophesying, he has already shown where he covers the woman that prophesies with a veil. So this first approach says it does call for the silence of women, and some scholars interpret it that way as taught by Paul, and some as not by Paul, but that's what the text means. The second interpretation, and it's a popular one today, is that Paul demands silence only for some specific kind of speech, whether only to disrupt his speech or only speech that judges prophecies. And the reason those interpretations are given is to avoid Paul contradicting what he says elsewhere in the chapter, in chapter 11.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that both of these interpretations interpret verse 34 to permit speech that verse 35 prohibits. Because if it's only disruptive speech that is prohibited, verse 35 also prohibits asking questions out of a desire to learn. And that's not disruptive speech. And so if that interpretation is correct, verse 34 permits what verse 35 prohibits. Same thing for the judging prophecy view. If the only thing that Paul is prohibiting is for a woman to judge a prophecy,
Mhm.
well, when you judge a prophecy, you're coming from above and you're saying that prophecy is wrong. You're judging the prophecy. You're saying, I know better than the person claiming this prophecy. But if someone asks a question out of a desire to learn, that implicitly acknowledges that the person admits, I don't have the answer, and they're asking a question in order to learn. So again, verse 34 permits any speech besides judging prophecy, but then verse 35 prohibits speech other than prophecy.
Mhm.
So uh, the third option, and that is some take verse 35 as defining what kind of speech Paul is prohibiting. He's only prohibiting the speech identified in verse 35, namely women asking questions out of a desire to learn. C.K. Barrett, however, argues that such a reading is not worthy of serious consideration. It ignores the obvious meaning of be silent. Specific prohibitions require specific modifiers, and none of the three prohibitions of speech include such a modifier. Furthermore, he's not saying, I do not permit a woman to inquire. He's
Mhm.
saying, I'm not permitting a woman to speak. And it can't be the only thing that's being prohibited, because logically, if women are prohibited from asking questions out of a desire to learn, then they would obviously also be prohibited from asking questions when they weren't desiring to learn.
Mm.
Uh, so that's the third position. Uh, the fourth position is, uh, and some scholars recently have argued that these words come from Paul,
Mhm.
but they are criticizing a false prophecy in the church in Corinth. And that prophecy, some self proclaimed prophet in Corinth, is giving the content of 34 and 35 about silencing women.
Mhm.
And then Paul is objecting, no, that is not the case.
Mhm.
The This view is actually far more psychologically plausible than the view that Paul himself is telling women to do what so many other passages he affirms women doing. However, it has several problems. One is that none of the church fathers understood it this way.
Mhm.
So the people closest to Paul did not understand this as a quotation of Paul's opponents, which he then refutes. They understand it as a statement by Paul. Uh, Furthermore, there's no introduction which specifies it as a false prophecy, uh, nor are any of the other slogans that Paul does quote in 1 Corinthians uh, of his opponents are nearly this long. And all of them are given in the form of, this is your slogan, but, and then Paul states something that undermines that
Mhm.
slogan. We don't have that here. Uh, Furthermore, there's nothing in verses 36 to 38 that mentions anything in verse 34 and 35. If Paul were intending to quote his opponents and then refute them, you'd think he would mention something about what he's refuting in his refutation.
Mhm.
So it's ironically, I've mentioned these four different interpretations of the passage, but whenever I've debated someone about this and asked them, what do you think it means? Every one of those people have said, I don't know.
Hmm.
because they realize all the other interpretations I've just mentioned are internally contradictory, and they make Paul contradict himself. And they don't want to do that. But when I ask them, what does it mean? They refuse to say what they think it means, because then they will be calling Paul contradictory.
Mm.
So that's the big picture about the different views that are taken.
Mm. Much appreciated. Okay. So this kind of leads up into your view here. So you've written in your papers that there's evidence that these verses weren't in the original text by Paul. Can you quickly go over just like a quick understanding of why this idea of these two verses not being in Scripture, why that doesn't ruin the reliability of Scripture?
First of all, this is a unique case.
Mm-hmm.
There's no other passage in any manuscript of any of Paul's letters that moves this large a block of text this far away without an obvious reason. And so the key evidence that we regard it as a later addition does not undermine the reliability of any other passage in the Bible. Furthermore, the Chicago Statement of Biblical Inerrancy acknowledges that there are textual variances, and we are dependent upon scholars for determining the earliest form of the text that we can reconstruct. At least from the time of origin, all Christian scholars have acknowledged textual variants in our manuscripts. And those include even the addition of spurious blocks of text.
Mm-hmm.
In sharp contrast, it has been common for Muslim apologists to state that the Quran has never changed. It has never had a textual variant. Well, about 25 years ago, a wall in the oldest mosque in Sana'a, Yemen, was broken into in a reconstruction, and they found a trove of old Qurans in between the wall. And two of those Qurans were written in the 600s. Both of them are what we call palimpsests, where the original text of the Quran had been washed clean, and then the current standard text written over the text. But enough of the old ink survives that we can still read the text, the original text that was washed away. For instance, there's one place that says, whoever does not follow the teachings of Muhammad will be punished in this age. But the text that's written over it says, will be punished in this age and the hereafter. And all current editions of the Quran include and the hereafter. Well, that's a big textual variant with very significant implications.
Mm-hmm.
And so those people who have asserted with such confidence that the Quran has never had a textual variant, any Muslim who reads the recent research realizes that's not true. In Christianity, we don't have that problem because we've always acknowledged textual variants.
Mm-hmm.
And one reason there are comparatively few textual variants in the Quran is that when Uthman standardized the text of the Quran, he ordered that all other copies of the Quran be burned. Well, someone didn't want to burn the Quran, so they washed it and rewrote it here. But the goal was to eliminate competing editions so that Uthman's text would always and everywhere be the standard text. Mm-hmm. And he had it carefully copied and sent to all the major cities in the Muslim world. And that's why there's a comparatively standardized form of the Quran. I prefer honesty. Admit that the copyists have made errors and do our very best to use all the evidence to determine the original text. If someone really wanted to know what Muhammad taught, they'd want to know all those early texts that have been destroyed. Spiritually, there's also a benefit as well, that we don't know with 100% certainty the original text. It means that when we come to the text and interpret it, we are encouraged by the fact that we're dependent on copies to a bit of humility. And that's a good thing for scholars. It also, because we realize that there can be corruptions to the text, that the text, which is not occurring in only one place or depending on one interpretation of one passage, but those things that recur again and again and again throughout Scripture, we focus on the majors rather than building our theology on something obscure dependent on only one passage. And that's a very healthy thing. And when you look how Jesus summarized the law as love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, on these two are built the whole commandment. You look through the New Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures, and the primacy of love as a controlling ethical factor is obvious. And we can also look at the negative side. In churches that have taken, for instance, the alternate ending to the book of Mark about you will handle snakes and they will not hurt you. Well, people have died handling snakes by taking a passage that was added to the text, but is not in any of the earliest manuscripts, and saying, this is the text, and we're going to live by it. So, again, humility and acknowledging the problem with that text could have saved people death by snake poisoning.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Who knew this topic could be so dangerous? Yeah, my next question, I appreciate that, but my next question was just talking about the manuscripts in general. So could you give us just a survey of the earliest texts we have on 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35?
Yeah, we have three sources for this passage, and the earliest is around or a little bit after 200 AD. We have Papyrus 46, which is dated circa 200, that includes those verses. We have the statements by Origen and the two statements by Tertullian that I quoted earlier, and they too are in the 200s, not too far from 200 AD. So our very first evidence for the text is approximately 200 AD.
Okay, much appreciated. Alrighty. And so you kind of talked about the variation. So basically, are you saying that we don't have any texts that don't have it in there, but we do have texts that they're in different places? Is that right?
No, I'm not saying that. We do have texts that do not have the verses. And
Okay.
I'll cite some of those later.
Okay.
Some people state there's no manuscript that does not include these verses. And that is only technically correct if one defines manuscript as a substrate, such as papyrus or vellum or parchment, that somewhere on that has those verses. But if you look at any standard critical edition of the New Testament, manuscripts are differentiated with symbols which identify different readings in the same manuscript, viewed as on the same vellum. So, for instance, you have a supportive reading could be B for Vaticanus, or you could have a different reading supported by B with a raised small c indicating corrector. And we'll get to other examples specifically about that here.
Mm-hmm.
But when scholars differentiate different readings, they use symbols for manuscripts that distinguish the different readings on that same substrate.
Okay. All right. So, I'm no scholar, so you're gonna have to maybe translate that for an educated person like myself. So,
Okay, so
yeah, one
basically,
more time.
let me give you one example, and
Okay.
when we get to it later, I'll just pass on.
Okay.
One of the oldest Bibles in Latin
Okay.
was commissioned by Bishop Victor of Capua.
Yeah.
Bishop Victor of Capua was a famous church scholar, the most famous textual scholar of his day. And manuscripts were brought to him that were discovered, and he would determine their significance. We know that he did this because at the end of the manuscript that he commissioned,
Mm-hmm.
he writes, I, Bishop Victor of Capua, on the, and it gives the number of the day of the month, 586 AD,
Mm-hmm.
went through this entire manuscript making corrections. And then there's another line, I, Bishop Victor of Capua, on this date, 587, went through the manuscript again making corrections. So we know that he's the one who commissioned the manuscript and who personally edited the manuscript. Well, at 1 Corinthians 14,
Mm-hmm.
we have the original text up above, which has the order that we're used to in our Bible.
Mm-hmm.
Verse 33 is followed by verse 34 and 35, followed by verse 36. And then in the bottom margin, Bishop Victor has told the original scribe to replace the text above with a different text. And we know it's a different text because the actual wording in the text is different than the text above. And the replacement text below omits verses 34 and 35. Bruce Metzger had written about this manuscript and said that it has 34 and 35 in the margin. And I talked with Bruce Metzger and showed him a photograph of the manuscript and showed him that 34 and 35 are not on the margin. The margin has the complete text rewritten without those verses. And he said, well, this is the first time I've actually seen a photograph of the manuscript. You're absolutely correct. And it is true that 34 and 35 are missing in the replacement text. And he compared the handwriting in the text at the bottom of the manuscript. And he said, this handwriting is obviously the same handwriting of the main text above. Furthermore, it's perfectly level. Someone had scored the space, and all the letters are smaller than the text above, but in the same hand style. So clearly, Bishop Victor realized, I don't have the skill to write this much text. I'm going to have the original scribe create space, create the lines, write the text, replacement text in without those verses. And so only he could have commissioned that. Only he had the authority to change the text. And clearly it's a text that omits it because it says up in the margin, read the text at the bottom of the page. And then at the bottom it says, continue reading above, and there's a Roman numeral where the same words continue, followed by chapter 15 with a big Roman numeral 15 in the margin. So Bruce Metzger said, yes, you're correct. This is a text rewritten to omit those verses, and it was done at the command of Bishop Victor of Capua. So here we have someone who had access to very early manuscripts, and on the basis of those, had the text rewritten without those verses. So one could say, You see, 34 and 35 are in Codex Fuldensis. See, it's right here. It's in the main text. But the more important text is the judgment of Bishop Victor of Capua, who had the text rewritten without those verses. So if someone says there's no manuscript evidence for the omission of those verses, they're simply ignorant.
That's really fascinating, and but pretty crazy even in itself that Metzger wouldn't notice that at first. That's pretty cool. That to hear that background there. Forgive me if I've messed up the order of the questions. So I was going to ask you about the variation between those. Did you have anything to add between the variation of all the different history of manuscripts that we have on this topic?
Well, the major thing, of course, is that the Western manuscripts have those two verses after verse 40. And most of the manuscripts, now there are exceptions, Reginensis and Manuscript 88 are not Western manuscripts, but in their text, 34 and 35 follows verse 40. But by and large, all the Western Greek manuscripts have 34 and 35 after verse 40. And almost all the other manuscripts have them after verse 33, except those manuscripts which don't include them at all.
Wow. Okay. Alrighty. So that's very helpful. All right. So then you got the question of the two dots. So let's talk about that. So we mentioned that earlier. We brought it up. I showed it a little bit. They're on the screen here. So you have on the left side, you have two dots. Try this again. Right there. Right there.
Yep.
So what is your view what those two dots means?
Those two dots occur in the Vaticanus New Testament about 765 times. Some of them are mirror impressions where ink was transferred from one page to the opposite page because the page was turned before the ink was completely dry. When I was looking for manuscript evidence to join 33b with verse 34, I noticed in Vaticanus this two dot symbol. So I started to read, what does it mean? And I could not find anyone who'd ever commented on what it meant. So I started to look for patterns. And I found a very strong correlation between the lines with two dots and significant textual variance in the manuscript tradition. And I published my findings in New Testament Studies,
There you go.
in which I laid out a table showing here's a line with two dots, and here are each of the 20 lines that follow the line with the two dots. And I showed for each of the cases where this occurs, the frequency of textual variance where there's a dot and where there's not a dot. And it's just a huge disparity where you have a very high percentage of the lines with dots with textual variance and a very low percentage of lines without the dots with such textual variance. Well, since then, a number of dissertations have been written about the two dot symbols in Vaticanus. Everyone has found the same close correspondence between the two dot symbol and textual variance. Even people who disagree with me about other things agree that the two dot symbol does have a close correspondence with textual variance, that it marks textual variance. That's the two dot symbol. The bar symbol, I found that there are 15 times in Vaticanus.
Right here, right? Under this K looking.
Where you have the two dots and the bar marking the same line. And the question has been, what does the bar mean? And to make a very quick overview, the bar is explained by the original Scribe of Vaticanus
Mm-hmm.
3 times in Isaiah, because in Isaiah, the horizontal bar is a standard symbol for text that was added in the Septuagint, but was not in the Hebrew text. And by all 3 explanations, the original scribe wrote this text marked with a horizontal bar, named an obelus,
Mm-hmm.
is not in the Hebrew text.
Hmm.
So we know that the scribe understood it, and we know because the ink in those explanations, some of it matches the original ink of the Codex. So here's a scribe who understood that the obelus was a standard symbol for marking spurious added text, and the scribe explained that 3 times in Isaiah. And in all 3 of the cases in Isaiah, there is a gap in the text at the precise point where a block of text was added in the Vaticanus text. Now, this symbol, the obelus, we know goes back to the original Scribe of Vaticanus because one of them is in the middle of text, separating letters on the line of text, and only the original scribe could put it there. We also know the scribe understood that it meant spurious added text because the scribe explains it 3 times to mean that. Well, in the New Testament, we have 15 times a bar with 2 dots and a gap on the text at the precise point where at least 4 consecutive words have been added in surviving manuscripts. So we have the same pattern. Furthermore, I found that the bars that correspond in meaning to the obelus have 5 characteristics in the New Testament. First of all, they underscore a line that is also marked by 2 dots. Second, they extend farther into the margin, on average 72.5% farther than the 31 bars, which are symbolizing a paragraph break, but just randomly occur by those bars. And for a while, I puzzled, are these paragraph marks that also function as a text critical symbol? Or what's the relationship? And then I found a dissertation that had studied all the occurrences of the paragraph marks in Vaticanus, in the Vaticanus New Testament, and concluded that none of them go back to the original manuscript. None of them match the original color of Vaticanus original ink. Visually, they're different. They're a darker ink. And so I went through Vaticanus and examined every time these paragraph marks occur. And they occur almost 3 times more than the 2 dot symbol. So there's 765. Well, there are over 2,500 paragraph marks in the New Testament. Very, very common. And because they were not part of the original text, no one could have confused the original scribe's obelus with them because they weren't there. But because there's so many of them, the probability is that roughly 30 would coincide with the 2 dot symbol. And in fact, 31 of these undisputed paragraph symbols do coincide. They occur by a line that also has 2 dots. But if you compare the paragraph symbols on these lines with 2 dots, the obeloi extend on average 72.5% farther into the margin than the paragraph symbols. Now that's a lot farther extension in the margin on average, because if they were all just paragraph marks, you'd expect them to be roughly similar in how far they extend in the margin. But that's a big difference on average. Furthermore, the third distinction is they are longer on average, 22% longer than the 31 undisputed paragraphoi bars by lines with two dots. The fourth difference is they occur by lines where the text was interrupted by at least 4 consecutive words in some manuscripts.
Hmm.
And New Testament manuscripts have preserved all 15 of those insertions marked by these distinctive bars. The characteristic bars, lines, on average, have 16 times more added words per line than the two dot lines with an undisputed paragraph bar. It turns out, if you look at the two most detailed recent editions of the Greek New Testament, that there is a 4 or more consecutive word addition to the text, on average, once every 83.5 lines of Vaticanus text. So if you were to open Codex Vaticanus and randomly pick a line, the odds that another surviving manuscript on somewhere on that line, anywhere on the line, adds at least 4 consecutive words, the odds of you're hitting one is 1 in 83.5. But all 15 have a 4 or more consecutive word addition surviving in manuscripts on that line. Some people have said, oh, it's mere coincidence. It doesn't mean anything. But let me give you an idea of how unlikely it is that because if these were not marking where spurious text interrupted the original text, then it would have to be just by coincidence. If, on the other hand, they were intentionally marking where text was added, well, of course, it makes perfect sense that the manuscripts would survive with the addition, because here's a scribe who was aware of that addition and marked it. But if, just to give you an idea how unlikely it is that it's random, if every second, day and night, for 100 trillion years, you were to select 15 random lines in Vaticanus, the odds that any of those random selections of 15 lines would all coincide with a 4 or more consecutive word textual variant is less than 1 in 2,000. It doesn't look like it's random, folks. It looks deliberate. And only the original scribe can leave a gap in the text. So, in addition to this, there is one other feature, and that is that in all 15 of these lines, there is a gap in the text where there's no writing at the precise point that other manuscripts insert additional text of at least 4 consecutive words. Now, those statistics I just gave you, the probability, that's for anywhere in the line. But all of these are precisely at the point of a gap on the line. You see, it was standard in Greek philology to use a horizontal bar to mark the location of spurious added text. It was called an obolus. It's regarded as the most clearly understood symbol of all the textual symbols used in Greek philology. Origen used the obolus to mark where the Septuagint text added words that were not in the Hebrew text. Vaticanus has this obolus symbol 121 times in the prophetic books of the Septuagint. And scholars regard the scribe of the entire New Testament to be the same scribe who penned the prophetic books in the Old Testament. And that's the only part of the Vaticanus Old Testament that includes these obelisk symbols.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's wild. So I was just going to ask you, so that space that you're talking about is the one where this red triangle is, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So
There's a
just for
gap in
some,
the line.
yeah, just for
Yeah.
some clarity, the other texts have it like right here
Yeah.
and
Yeah. There's
and
another one. Good.
and then right here, just
And
so like,
you can see where there's a gap in the text.
mhm,
The pattern is, and even in the Nestle-Aland text, when there has been an insertion of 4 or more words
mhm,
that would be inserted at the end of a line of text, the Nestle-Aland text almost always has a symbol for the insertion on the line, which at the very end of the line. So what Vaticanus has done in leaving gaps at the end of a line matches that pattern.
mhm.
When
I see.
I published this first study in New Testament studies, I got a letter from Paul Canar at the Vatican, and he said, "This is really interesting." He's the prefect of the Vatican Library, and he said, "I would like you to come over, and together we can examine to see if any of these 2 dot symbols match the original ink of the Codex." Well, I was delighted and took my whole family over there and went in and went past the librarian's desk into a hallway. End of the hallway, there's a bank vault door. And we went through the bank vault door into the manuscript room. And then in the back corner, there's a steel grated separate room with its own locked door where the most precious manuscripts are kept. And along the wall, there's a steel cabinet with every leaf of Codex Vaticanus in a separate acid-free binding. And we went through the instances which I thought were the most likely cases where we might find the original text of the manuscript. This is right here is the volume that was published by the Vatican of Codex Vaticanus.
Oh, wow.
And none of its 2 dot symbols match the original color of the manuscript. The color reproduction is not reliable. But as we worked on this, we would look at the ink first with a naked eye and then with an internally lighted loupe so that each dot filled our vision through this loupe.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see in some cases this rich apricot color. And then I'd look along to the adjacent text and see a letter that had not been re-inked. Most of the text was re-inked, but at the time it was re-inked, there were different spelling conventions. So, for instance, the verb to judge, krino, in Vaticanus originally was written kreno, epsilon iota. But the later spelling was just with the iota. And so the epsilon was not re-inked. And you could see the original ink of the manuscript in that letter. Similarly, the final N in letters, the final nu, it's called a movable nu, in the later convention was not written. But they were written in Vaticanus originally. And so those final nus were not re-inked. And you can see the original apricot color. So Paul Canar and I were looking at the ink of the dots and looking at a nearby unre-inked text and looking at that apricot color in one and the other. And he looked up at me and said, said, "C'est la même couleur." It's the same color. Well, we published our findings in Novum Testamentum. We found 11 cases that matched the original ink.
Hmm.
And I said, Paul, the Vatican needs to make a high quality, faithful reproduction of the ink of Codex Vaticanus. And I urged him to do that. Well, I got an email a few years later saying, I have good news for you. The Italian State Publishing House has agreed to make a new printing of Codex Vaticanus. And this is that volume. I got one of the very first copies of Codex Vaticanus. And it is an amazingly faithful reproduction.
Can you open it up? Show us what it looks like inside.
Oh, inside, sure.
Oh, that thing's huge. Oh, man.
And
it looks like it's from the 3rd century.
Well, it does. Every leaf has exactly the borders of the original leaf.
Oh, wow.
Every time there's a significant hole in the manuscript, there's a hole in the reproduction. And the justification is so good that the text wraps properly right around the hole on both front and back.
Wow, that's awesome.
And the color, when I got my first copy, I went through every one of these roughly 765 two-dot symbols. They're actually about 800, but some of them are transferred ink that is just called offset ink. It's not original there. And I found, in addition to the 11 we'd originally found, I found 40 more that appeared to be similar to that apricot color. And Paul Canar went to the Vatican manuscript room, checked every one of them, and wrote back, we now have 40 more cases of original ink distigmi. Well, actually, when I compared some of the ones that he'd called original ink in the new facsimile, and I looked at original ink nearby, I could see differences in the color. But he could see the original, I couldn't see the original, so I trusted him on that one. And it turns out on some of those cases, he was wrong. They weren't original. But that's another issue. So the what we did, we published then in this book called Le Manuscrit de la Bible, which is considered the most important publication about Codex Vaticanus ever published, an analysis of these 51 distigmi, as we call them, the two-dot symbols that appear to have ink that is related to the apricot color ink, and showed the remarkable correlation between them and textual variants. So in addition to encouraging the Vatican to make a high-resolution facsimile, I also encouraged them, if they could possibly do it, to do scientific analysis of the ink to confirm what are the characteristics of the original ink. And I got contacted later by Nehemiah Gordon, who is a specialist in this, and I urged him, check the 11 that we found to match the original text, and which really do match it in the facsimile. And he said, well, I'm going to go over there and we'll check as many as we can. And he gave a report last November at SBL. And in that report, he identified some cases where they could identify the original ink signature. It's a process called X-ray fluorescence. They actually burn a little teeny line of ink so that it vaporizes the ink, and then they analyze the ratio of copper to iron in that little sample. And they could determine the original ink signature of Vaticanus. Well, of the 15 cases where we have this bar, there was one case where, even though there was no paragraph bar that appeared to match the original apricot colored Vaticanus, the left side of this one obulus looked to me like the same color as original text on the same page. And I urged Nehemiah Gordon to test that one. And he did. And he found that the ink signature of the left side of that horizontal bar exactly matches the original ink signature on the same page. But the right hand matches the re-inking on the same page. And so we have in the same bar original ink and re-inking. So this confirmed that not only does it look original to the naked eye, but the actual ink testing confirmed that it is equal. Unfortunately, when Nehemiah Gordon's team analyzed the ink signatures, they did not test any of the 11 that Paul Canar and I had identified as matching the original ink. So I've urged him to make a new appointment at the Vatican and to examine those, because I would like to know, because it's an important question as whether those go back. But the key thing to summarize is that we have several evidences that this horizontal bar symbol in these cases where it's marking spurious added text actually does match the original ink signature of Vaticanus, not only visually, but in fact. And there's another case where he also tested ink that I could not, and I still today cannot see with the naked eye the difference, but with his testing, he was able to confirm that that obulus as well matches the original Inca Codex on the same page. So we have the gap on the line that only the original scribe could leave. We have the color of ink matching original ink. We have the ink signature scientific testing that matches the original ink. So we have strong evidence that this pattern of 15 cases do in fact mark the location of blocks of added text. Now, interestingly, there is one additional case where we have the two dots in the bar and a gap on the line of text at the precise point. I'm sorry, two dots in the bar on a line where other manuscripts add a large block of text. But on that line, there is no gap. And in that case, both dots and the bar have a downward dipping ink that's different than and this is the case right here. This is the case. Thank you for showing it. You see, both dots have a downward dipping bit, and the bar has a long downward dipping bit at the right end, but there's no gap in that text. So this appears to me to be a different hand, not the original hand. It says this downward dipping tendency of both the dots and the bar. But that later scribe that recognized what the symbols meant and added them where text was added could not add a gap in the text. The added text appears where the red triangle is in some other manuscripts.
Okay, so just for some clarity there, so I'll put both on the screen, one from First Corinthians 14, and then the Acts 6:10, which is the one where it doesn't have a gap. So the bottom one doesn't have a gap, the top one does. So you're saying that someone came in later and added those,
The
the,
one on the bottom,
uh,
someone understood that this symbol
mm,
was marking spurious added text.
mm,
They knew that a block of text was added at this point on that line,
mm,
and so that later scribe added the two dots and the bar to mark what happens on that line.
mm. Interesting. Okay, that's interesting. Of course, I mean, you could see right here that, I mean, as you were saying, it's like it's downward pointing. So let me see if I can get that out of the way. So, like, you can see right under my finger here that it's like pointing down
Yep.
at the end, and these two dots are also pointing down. But then you're saying this over here was added afterwards. Is that right?
Uh, the there is no gap on the line
Mm-hmm.
at the point where the text was added.
Mm-hmm.
The red triangle shows where the text was added.
Mm-hmm.
It's not in Vaticanus, but that's the whole point of the symbol. The symbol is saying other manuscripts have added spurious text here. Now, it's interesting that of the 16 lines, including this one,
Mm-hmm.
both the Nestle-Aland text and the UBS text, the two standard editions of the Greek New Testament, agree that all 15 other blocks of added text were not in the original text.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is significant because it shows that the judgments made by Scribe B, the original scribe of the New Testament of Vaticanus, are judgments that we can trust. Our critical texts in every other case agree with Scribe B. That this scribe, I shouldn't say he made it, because Origen said he preferred scribes who were girls trained in penmanship. Apparently, back then, like today, girls tend to have better hand-eye coordination and better handwriting than boys. And so Origen preferred, and I suspect that they were also cheaper to hire than the men would have been. But in any event, we have two key reasons to believe that we can trust the judgment of Scribe B regarding let women be silent in the churches. Number one, Scribe B had access to far more early text of the New Testament than everything we have today. If we put together every papyrus, every pre-Vaticanus text we have, and put them all into one volume, it would be roughly the equivalent of one New Testament.
Mm.
We know that the Scribe of Vaticanus had access to many different New Testaments because of the nature of the variants that the scribe has marked with these symbols. The second reason is that scholars today, working with all the evidence we have today, agree with the Scribe of Vaticanus
Mm-hmm.
that every other one of passage, every other block of added text was not in the original text.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have a good reason to trust this scribe. There's another reason I think we should trust the scribe, and that is the scribe was meticulous in not changing the original text. Well, you say, well, how can you know that? Well, let me give you some examples. For one, we mentioned that in the prophetic books of the Old Testament, there are 121 times when you have this obelisk symbol marking spurious added text. It's not in the Hebrew text. Well, in addition to those 121, there are 14 other cases where there is no horizontal bar in the margin, but written in small letters like those 3 passages in Isaiah that describe oboloi and what they mean is an abbreviation for this text is not in the Hebrew. Now, it would be so much easier for Scribe B to put a little horizontal bar in the margin instead of writing in teeny unsealed text, this text is not in the Hebrew, 14 times. The scribe realized that Origen symbols were integral to Origen's edited text of the Septuagint. And so the scribe did not add a single obolus that was not in the original text. In each case, 14 times, the scribe wrote these teeny little abbreviations in the margin saying this text is not in the Hebrew. Only someone who's determined to preserve the original text will do that. Another example, in the epistles of the New Testament, every sentence ends with a period. It's a raised dot. In the Gospels, there are virtually no periods in any Gospel. I actually did find one raised dot period in Mark, but it's a dark black ink that's not at all like the original ink. The scribe was so careful in preserving the original text, the scribe didn't even add periods at the end of sentences. And we know how useful periods are in determining where the sense break is. So if there's a period in the text, you're not going to take it out. But the scribe didn't add periods. Another example, I mentioned the different spelling changes and the old spelling in Vaticanus of cranon with epsilon iota. Well, there are cases where Vaticanus Gospels have the old epsilon iota spelling, but P75, a papyrus of Luke and John that Bruce Metzger dated to 175 to 225 AD, it has the later spelling with a iota instead of epsilon iota. So you have the preservation of old spelling forms that were no longer conventional, the preservation of lack of punctuation, even when it would have been convenient. And in the prophetic books in Zechariah, there are cases where we do have original paragraph markers, this paragraph symbol that matches the original ink of the Codex. And other ones have been re-inked. By the way, that's one of the evidences we're so confident that the New Testament paragraph markers were not original to the text. Because if in a small book like Zechariah, you'll have 4 cases with original ink paragraph markers, surely if they were original to the New Testament, some of those 2,500 to 3,000 cases would have matched the original ink visually, but none of them do. So, but in any event, there are places in Zechariah where the paragraph symbol has been preserved by Scribe B, but the paragraph symbol that was preserved from the exemplar manuscript conflicted with Scribe B's own judgment about where the paragraph should break. So here's a scribe who's not changing the text. He's not adding to the text. He or she is not taking away from the text, is not changing the spelling to update it, is not even adding periods to the text. And furthermore, if you compare this Papyrus 75 to Vaticanus, Vaticanus has only half as many nomina sacra abbreviations. These are where you have a holy name like Jesus, where only the first and last letter are written with a bar over it to mark an abbreviation. Twice as many nomina sacra forms occur in P75 than Vaticanus. Well, when you put all this together, it means that the text of all 4 Gospels in Vaticanus should be dated much earlier than P75. So if Metzger is correct that P75 is to be dated 175 to 225, then the Vaticanus Gospels text has to go back to the 100s. And it's not just part of the text, it's the entire text of all four Gospels, barring, of course, inadvertent copy errors by the original scribe. Now, I have mentioned Codex Vaticanus a lot, but Codex Vaticanus marking these as a spurious edition, it's just one of 11 reasons from manuscripts and 11 reasons from words in these verses that these words are a later gloss. I use the word gloss carefully. Some scholars use the word interpolation to mark where text has been added that was not originally there. In this case, I don't think that's a good word to describe it, because the word interpolation comes from the Latin word meaning to polish. And when you polish something, you're deliberately making it what you think is better. You're changing it deliberately. But when it's a gloss, that's something that someone has written in the margin. And a scribe, every scribe who's ever copied a manuscript, knows that they sometimes inadvertently leave a word out from the text. So what do when that happens? Well, they write the word in the margin. And in Codex Vaticanus, in the Gospel of Matthew, there are 20 cases where you have small unsealed text written in the margin. 17 of those 20 cases, according to the Nestle-Aland text, every subsequent manuscript has those words not in the margin, but in the body text. 100% of those 17. So the pattern was that when a scribe is copying a text, because they would put text in the margin, when they see text in the margin, they automatically put it in the text. Ulrich Schmidt has done careful analysis of this and has found that it was conventional for scribes to put text that was in the margin into the body text. So when you ask, why does it seem more likely that the text was originally in the margin and then was later copied into the text, not trying to polish the text, but simply trying to preserve the text by putting it back in? See, the scribe is not changing the text. The scribe is just preserving what's there. And you ask, which is more likely, that the text was originally after verse 33 and someone moved it to go after verse 40? Or was it originally after verse 40 and someone moved it to be after verse 33? Either one of those two, if that were what happened, it's the only time in any manuscript of any of Paul's letters that any scribe ever moved that large block of text that far away without an obvious reason. So it's a unique occurrence.
Yeah.
It's very unlikely because it's unique. On the other hand, if the text was originally in the margin and scribes decided I'm going to put it in, well, it's just conventional to put it in. So which is more probable to have happened? Something that is unique or something that is common convention?
Right.
Well, common convention is far more likely than something that never happened anywhere else. We call this transcriptional probability. That is the argument that Gordon Fee found the most compelling, that these verses were not in the original text. The second manuscript reason is Codex Vaticanus. We've already talked about that, because it marks those verses as a spurious later addition with a symbol that everywhere else marks spurious added text, and our critical editions agree in every case that the added text is spurious. The third we talked about as well, and that's Codex Valdensis. by Bishop Victor, where
Hmm.
he had the text rewritten to omit those verses. The fourth is Manuscript 88, a Greek manuscript, where the scribe copied a text that went from verse 33 to 36, skipping 34 and 35. And the scribe comes to the end of that passage and realizes, I have left something out that I'm sure was in other manuscripts, and probably looked at another manuscript, and sure enough, let women keep silence in the churches. I didn't put it in. So the scribe then puts on the baseline of the text a double slash. But he puts a double slash before the end of verse 40. Now, if the scribe had intended, if the scribe were copying a manuscript that had those verses after verse 40, you would expect the mark of transposition to be after the period with the text that's going to go back above, but it's marked on the baseline. So the most natural explanation of this is that the scribe intended the reader to put 34 and 35 after verse 33. And it's interesting, the double slash after verse 33 is not on the baseline because the scribe had already written it. The scribe couldn't change it. The double slash is above the last letter of verse 33. Now, and in the margin, there's another double slash. So the reader sees, oh, this text is supposed to go here.
Hmm.
The most natural explanation of this is that it was copied from a manuscript that didn't have those verses. It's a non-Western manuscript, so we know the text is not copied from a Western text, which would explain why it's after verse 40. It's copied from a non-Western text.
Hmm.
And so it's most likely copied from a text that went from 33 to 36, skipping those verses.
Hmm.
Then a fifth manuscript reason is that there's a very high incidence of textual variance in these two verses, far higher than the surrounding text of 1 Corinthians. And this is typical when text has been added later, that it will have more textual variance than the other text. Then there are five more. That's been six. Oh, that's the sixth reason is for believing that those verses were not originally in the text, is that none of the apostolic fathers ever refers to these verses about women being silenced in the church. Even though 1 Corinthians was the book that they quoted most from in the 2nd century. And many of these fathers quote text around chapter 14 without referring to these verses. It's an argument from silence in one sense, but it's not just the apostolic fathers, but a whole slew of those 2nd century writers who have no reference to these verses, even though it was a hot issue. It would have been a hot issue. How do we perform worship in the churches?
Yeah.
And can women be involved? There are five more manuscript evidences, all of which are statements that probably would not have been made if their authors had 34 and 35 in their text.
Okay.
The Acts of Paul reports that Paul told Thecla, quote, go and teach the word of God. And then goes on to say, enlightening many with the word of God. Now, if your manuscript said women must be silent in the churches, are you going to say this? I don't think so. Irenaeus writes, quote, "For in his epistle to the Corinthians, Paul speaks expressly of prophetical gifts and recognizes men and women prophesying in the church." So Peter W. Dunn argues that Irenaeus would not have said this if his text had 34 and 35.
Hmm.
Clement of Alexandria writes, quote, "Woman and man are to go to church decently attired with natural step, embracing silence." The woman and man embracing silence, fit to pray to God, for this is the wish of the word,
Hmm.
since it is becoming for her to pray veiled. Such ought those who are consecrated to Christ appear and frame themselves in their whole life as they fashion themselves in the church for the sake of gravity. If his text said women are to be silent, why would he speak of woman and man being silent? Victorinus of Patau cites 1 Corinthians 11 embedded between two quotations from 1 Corinthians 14:29. Because 34 and 35 come so closely after verse 29, it would be incongruous for anyone to write whose text of 1 Corinthians 14 included those verses. Here's what he says: "Let the prophets speak, 2 or 3, and let the others judge." That's quoting verse 29. And he says, "Every woman that prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head," quoting 11:5. And when he says, "Let the prophets speak, 2 or 3, and let the others judge," whether or not the interpretation is consistent with the testimonies of the prophetic utterance. Well, he's specifically referring to women in the context of judging the prophets. So the interpretation that this is only about judging the prophets is directly contradicted by Victorianus of Patau, and it's most likely that his text didn't have those verses. Professor Fernando Saravi argues that since Pseudo-Clement's first epistle to the virgins addresses both male and female virgins, it seems that its author, too, was not aware of 14:34 to 35. Section 10 states, "If you have a gift received from the Lord, administer it to the pneumatic ones, to those who know that what you say is from the Lord, for the edification of Christ's brotherhood." So here we see 11 evidences from manuscripts that those verses were not there. There's one big objection, and that is people say, well, it must have been extraordinarily early to have gotten into all the surviving manuscripts. Well, I would say first, we need to put an asterisk after all and explain that some of those manuscripts note that the text was not originally there. But secondly, the very first evidence we have of anyone being aware of this text is around 200 AD. And once those words have been written in the margin and someone copies them, the assumption has been this could only happen if those added words go back to the original manuscript or very close to it. But let's look at another example. In Ephesians chapter 5, Paul says, submitting one to another out of reverence for Christ. Wives to your own husbands as to the Lord. Now, in the Greek, there's no verb submit in wives to your own husbands. And the earliest manuscripts have no verb submit, P46 and Vaticanus. The church fathers that comment on this this verse 22 almost universally do not include the verb submit.
Hmm.
Jerome writes that no Greek manuscripts include the verb submit in verse 22. The United Bible Society's Greek New Testament ranks the likelihood of their text being correct. And in this case, they say it's almost certain that there was no verb submit here. Ironically, the Tyndale House Greek New Testament does put the verb submit in. But in its introduction, it says, our goal is to present the earliest form of the New Testament text. And no one contests that the earliest form didn't have the verb submit. No one contests that. So why did they do that? Interestingly, their footnotes show that when the verb submit was added, it was added in 3 different grammatical forms in 2 different locations, sometimes after man, sometimes after woman.
Oh, well.
These are the hallmarks of a later edition.
Mm-hmm.
You can't read the Ephesians 5 passage in a wedding ceremony specifically about marriage and only include the stuff about marriage without adding the verb submit. You can't begin this wives to your own husbands as to the Lord with no verb. You have to put it in. And so it would be natural for someone to include that in any situation where they're addressing marriage specifically. And because it's included in 3 different grammatical forms in 2 different locations, clearly people are deciding what are we going to add to the text to make it clear?
Right.
And where will we add it? So I've written to the editor saying, you've got to correct this because it's just obviously wrong. Hopefully they will correct that. But I'm not sure because the publisher is Crossway. And Crossway has committed itself to a strong complementarian position.
Oh, interesting.
And I suspect that they will be fighting their financial purse strings to make that change. But we'll see. By the way, when I sent to the New International and the ESV revision committees evidence for how to translate the verb in 1 Timothy 2:12, authentane, I gave 18 instances where in Greek literature it meant to seize authority one does not rightfully have. And I showed that the very first instance in all of Greek literature where the verb means to exercise authority is 370 AD, 3 centuries after Paul. The editor of the NIV, the chairman of the editorial committee for the 2011 revision, was Doug Moo. He sent my recommendation to the committee, and the committee consisted of a majority of complementarians, but the committee voted to change the text from to have authority to assume authority, to take authority to oneself. I asked the chairman of the ESV revision committee, and he said, I never gave it to the committee. I didn't think it was that important. So because Crossway published both volumes and because that exclusion of data characterized the one, I'm very interested to see what they will do in the Ephesians 5 passage.
Yeah, well, the Ephesians 5 passage seems even more obvious than all those other ones, so you would think that that has a little bit higher chance of working out, but yeah, as you said, you never know. But yeah,
So,
what were you going to say?
the bottom line is when the verb submit first occurs in a Greek manuscript, it's in Codex Sinaiticus, written about 350 to 360 AD. There's no manuscript of the New Testament prior to Codex Sinaiticus that includes the verb submit, zero. But there is no manuscript written after Codex Sinaiticus that doesn't have the verb submit. They all have the verb submit.
Yep.
100%. So here's a case where all the earliest commentators have no verb submit. And the church fathers commenting on it almost always do not have the verb submit. But once it's in the text, every subsequent text has it. My point is that even though it was first added in 350 to 360 in a surviving manuscript, every single subsequent manuscript has it, indicates that once it's in the text, no one is going to take it out. And we ask why? Well, because it reinforced the cultural wisdom of the day. It was generally believed that women should be in submission. And they viewed that in terms of a hierarchy of authority. And so once the verb submit is there, no one is going to take it out. In the same way, it was cultural convention for women to be silent in public assemblies. There were Greek laws about this. Aristophanes wrote a play about women taking over the Senate. It's a comedy because it's so incongruous. This would never happen. The cultural wisdom of the day reinforced it. And so even if someone wrote that in a manuscript sometime late in the 100s, it could still explain every manuscript we have. Also, when you think of it, the people who wrote in the margin were people who had economic clout. A single page of vellum cost a day's wage. So having something like the book of 1 Corinthians, or maybe all of Paul's letters in private hands, well, that's a wealthy person. And if that wealthy person writes in the margin that women keep silence in the churches, then that person may well want that idea to get out, and so make that manuscript available to copyists who will copy it, and that could quickly spread. My point is that one cannot assume, or one should not assume, that these words had to be added extraordinarily early. So we've looked at 11 reasons from manuscripts where all of those are explained naturally if those words were originally written in the margin and then were later copied into the text. But there are also 11 internal factors which cause people to regard these verses as a later addition not by Paul. First, of course, is that they contradict Paul's encouraging women to speak in church. Second is they interrupt the flow of Paul's argument and they break its chiastic structure. Third, they appropriate words from the context, but use them in ways that are alien to its context. Robert Allison and Wayne Meeks give examples of this. Fourth, verses 34 and 35 conflict with the goal of instruction in the church. Fifth, just as the law says, does not fit Paul's teaching that believers are free from the law. Paul never elsewhere uses the Old Testament to establish a rule for Christian worship. In fact, he repeatedly repudiates attempts to impose Old Testament regulations on believers. Number 6, contrary to Paul championing the cause of the downtrodden, verses 34 to 35 subordinate a weak social group. David W. Gill and Andrew Clark argue this. Number 7, there are 8 words in these verses that reflect words from 1 Timothy 2, 9 to 15. Both use the verb permit. There's only one other instance in all of Paul's letters where this same verb is used. But it's not just that the verb is used. In both cases, permit governs more than one verb, with the last one introduced by but. And remarkably, both 1 Timothy 2:12 and many manuscripts of 1 Corinthians 14:34, the verb permit fits only the first verb, to speak or to teach, but not the last verb, to submit or to be in quietness. This is a rare grammatical error called zoigma, occurring in both places. Its command that women be silent reflects 1 Timothy 2:11 to 12's 2 calls for women to be quiet. Its 2 prohibitions of women speaking reflects 1 Timothy 2:11 to 12's restrictions on women teaching. Its command that women be in submission reflects the calls for women to be in all submission in 1 Timothy 2:11. Its reference to the law reflects 1 Timothy 2:13 to 14's references to the account of creation and fall in Genesis. Its to learn reflects the identical verb learn in 1 Timothy 2:11. Its disgrace for a woman in verse 35 reflects the repeated concern in 1 Timothy 2:9 to 15 for women to avoid disgrace and to follow propriety. Furthermore, both passages are in the context of rules for church worship. Consequently, the wording appears to have been influenced by the much later written 1 Timothy 2, 9 to 15. And that's something that's far more likely to happen after the writing of 1 Timothy 2, 9 to 15 than before it. Reason number 8, the command in verse 34 addresses women in the churches. Every other command in 1 Corinthians addresses the Corinthian church. This fits a time when the letter was distributed throughout the churches, not its original audience. Number 9, the word usage is uncharacteristic of Paul, in particular, as the law says. Paul almost always writes, "it is written," when quoting specific scriptures. The only 2 times that Paul uses "as the law says," he specifically quotes the passage in question.
Mm-hmm.
Furthermore, there is no Old Testament law that commands women not to speak or commands women to be in subjection. Philip Abbott has argued that it's doubtful that Paul would silence Chloe in her own home. And finally, 11, verses 34 to 35 fit an obvious motive for a gloss, namely to silence women in church, which was a standard common wisdom of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Most scholars who are aware of even a part of this evidence have also concluded that Paul did not write these verses. For instance, the Greek Orthodox scholar David Bentley Hart, whose The New Testament A translation, rejects 1434 and 35 as, quote, almost certainly spurious.
Well.
The German Bible Society's new Basisbibel notes that these verses contradict chapter 11, 2 to 16, and is probably a later insertion. The famous Roman Catholic scholar Joseph Fitzmyer notes that, quote, the majority of commentators today regard these verses as a later addition. The textual scholar Kim Heinz Eitzen states this of, quote, nearly all scholars now. Gordon Fee, the most famous evangelical textual scholar, argues that these verses were not in Paul's letters, but were added in the margin and inserted by later copyists, either after verse 33 or verse 40. My Man and Woman One in Christ book identifies 55 different studies that conclude that those verses were not originally in Paul's letters. And there have been dozens since then.
Mm. Very fascinating. I appreciate all that. Okay. So let's see where we are here. Let's see. All right. Yep. Okay. So you did talk about the idea that a lot of people think that if it was in the original text, it might have been like part of the side margins. Could you go into a little bit more detail why they would say that's part of the side margins? Is that saying that Paul, when he originally wrote the text, was putting in the side margins, and why would he do that? Why wouldn't he put that in the main text?
Okay, first of all, the people who argue this by Paul
Mm-hmm.
usually argue that it was always in the main text.
Okay.
That's what they usually do.
Okay.
But there are evangelical scholars who attribute it to Paul, but say that it originally occurred in the margin, because only that would explain our manuscript tradition.
Okay.
The most valiant attempt to argue that these verses were transposed, either deliberately or accidentally, was by Antoinette Weyer, and her attempts fail miserably. Even she admits there's no single obvious explanation why such an inversion of sentences or omission and reinsertion took place. In fact, she doesn't provide a single comparable scribal change. She proposes that the corrector assumes, quote, perhaps in the light of later house codes, that what was said to women concerned household rather than church order. But would a scribe regard these verses as about household codes rather than church order, in spite of their being preceded by in all the churches, beginning in the churches and concluding in the church? Furthermore, verses 34 and 35 specifically contrast their ruling regarding church with what is permitted at home. Aware of the weakness of this explanation, Wire then suggests an alternate explanation. Quote, that this passage is displaced due to the corrector's ideological point of view, but without explaining either the ideological motivation or how the displacement would advance it. Wire fails to provide a reasonable explanation for the displacement. She properly concludes most New Testament copyists were conservative, and changing the text's meaning or even clarifying it were not common scribal practices.
I appreciate that. All right. So there's another question. So a lot of people have heard of the woman caught in adultery, where we don't have any that in the earliest texts, and it's moving all around the place in different manuscripts. But there are some people that still think that is a true story. So I could see maybe someone saying, "Hey, this, 34 and 35 weren't part of the original text, but maybe they were what Paul actually thought." So I guess you would just say that, it's, it contradicts with all these other passages that we have about prophesying in chapter 11 and everywhere else. Did you have anything that additionally that makes you think that wouldn't be right?
Well, let's take the comparison between the woman caught in adultery and this passage. They actually have a lot of things in common. In both cases, you have the text appearing in different locations in manuscripts. In both cases, it appears to disrupt the flow of the text where it is. In both cases, there is word usage that's atypical of the author. In both cases, there's a high incidence, far higher incidence of textual variance within the disputed text than the surrounding text. So the interesting thing is that most of our recent Bibles either do not include it in their text or include it in square brackets or have a footnote saying that this was not in the early manuscripts, but was added later in different places. I think that the character of the text does point to a Jesus saying that is unlikely to have been created in the early church. It seems to Jesus is treating this adulteress as someone who should not be judged. And that kind of lenience is not the kind of thing that the church would tend to put on Jesus' lips. I think, therefore, the story may well reflect an event in Jesus' life. But I think we should be honest in our manuscripts to say that the evidence is it was not originally in the text. And then the question comes, when something was not originally in the text, do we regard that as divinely inspired text and with authority over us? Or do we regard it as a later addition? And I think there's several things in both Scripture's statements about scriptural authorship and inspiration, and also in the church's discussion about inspiration, that show us that the church did not regard things that were not by the original authors as having authority over the church. We see this in the many, many statements throughout the New Testament about God has spoken through the apostles and prophets. We see it on Jesus' lips many times. We also see in Revelation a stark example I warn everyone who hears the words of this prophecy of this book, if anyone adds anything to them, God will add to that person the plagues described in this book.
Hmm.
Well, it's very clear that adding to the text is not right. When the work called the Acts of Paul and Thecla
Mm-hmm.
was determined to have been written by someone other than Paul,
Mm-hmm.
he was brought before the church authorities and he defended himself, saying, I was trying to honor Paul by this. And they had him defrocked
Hmm.
because you do not add to text, the text of Scripture. In Matthew 5, Jesus says, for truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until all is accomplished. The sense is that once Scripture is written, it will not be overturned.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and we have these references throughout the New Testament affirming authority based on the apostles and the prophets. And of course, any addition to that would not come with that same authority. For instance, Romans 1:2 states, God revealed his word, quote, through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. The implication is if someone adds to the prophets, it wouldn't be Holy Scripture. Ephesians 2:20 states that the household of God is, quote, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus himself being the chief cornerstone. Again, the foundation is the apostles and prophets. And so adding to that wouldn't be the foundation. Ephesians 3:5, God's word, quote, has been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit. Well, if the Spirit is revealed to the prophets and apostles, then adding to it would be undermining that. 1 Peter 3:2, quote, remember the predictions of the holy prophets and the command of our Lord and Savior through your apostles. Well, have a post-apostolic comment would not fit that. Luke 11:48, Jesus said, God in his wisdom said, I will send them prophets and apostles. Again, Luke 18:31, Jesus said, everything that is written in the prophets about the human son, and by the way, the Son of Man, translate anthropos, man, it should be human. And furthermore, Jesus was not the son of a male man, but he was the son of Mary. So the better translation is about the human son will be fulfilled.
Hmm.
Luke 24, Jesus said, how foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. And 44, everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms. So adding to Scripture was regarded as undermining prophetic authority. Furthermore, when the early church determined the basis for including works in the canon, a key criteria was, did it come with apostolic authority? And they rejected later editions.
Hmm. I appreciate that. You must have an either endless amount of ability to memorize things or you have a long dissertation worth of notes right in front of you. I appreciate it. All right. So a little bit of a break here, and the reason is because we have someone who's been very kind enough to uh, give what they call super chats, which is just donating money. So to ask a question. So I definitely wanted to ask it, and it's totally okay if you don't know the answer to it. Totally fine. Um, if you don't have anything, just feel free to just say so. Okay, so he's got a few questions here, so you bear with me here. All right, so His name is JC. In the Peshitta, the Megillah of Hebrew is frequently a KRK root, which is rarely used in Hebrew. KRKB and KRKM. Why are circles apocalyptic? So I don't know anything about this. Is this so? It seems random to me. Do you know anything about what he's referring to?
I don't know what he's referring to.
Okay.
And particularly, I'm not sure what he means by why are circles apocalyptic.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe JC can give us some help there. All right. So next one. Also, JC, kind enough to give $10. Corinthian capitals cover the source of the volutes of Proto-Aeolic capitals, which is the tree of life. Why is the pillar at the chapel of the derision flanked by Corinthian capitals? Do you know anything about this?
Uh, I do know about the difference in the capitals and
Okay.
how they were used and sometimes reused. Uh, there are different styles of capitals associated with different periods, but when a temple uh, went into disrepair, those capitals were things that the workmen would tend to preserve because there's a lot of work that went in making them,
Hmm.
and then would reuse them in later works. So, but I don't know what the Chapel of the Derision is. Uh, I suspect the reason it was flanked by Corinthian capitals, the Corinthian capitals were pretty old style. They were probably simply reused from a previous temple.
Hmm. Okay. And a capital that's like a
The capital is what put on the top of the column,
okay.
like in the Erechtheum in Athens, you have ladies, columns in the shape of a woman whose head is the capital holding up the roof. So the
Interesting.
capital is
Okay.
the top.
Like this right
There you
here.
go.
Okay. I did not expect to learn about that today. All right. Okay. Thank you so much for the question, JC. All right. He also said Ezekiel ate a carca de sapra, a roll of saffron. I don't know the relevance, but any thoughts there?
I don't know what the significance
I don't
of a
either.
roll of saffron would be, but
All right. Yeah.
presumably saffron would be more edible than most things.
All right, I appreciate that. And why is there a Corinthian capital at the top of the Golden Gate? ZHB Golden is from saffron. The Messiah enters through this gate, see its binding. So maybe he's referring back to the saffron that Ezekiel ate, maybe?
Possibly, yeah.
Okay. Anything you want to add there, or should we keep going?
You keep going.
Okay, all right. Not the questions I expected, but I really do appreciate it, JC. But yep. So, all right, let's keep going here. All right, so we talked about that original margins. Um, all right. So hypothetically, if you were wrong and it turns out this passage was actually in Paul's original letter, do you have any idea where it would have originally been? Do you have a best guess?
Well, if it were originally in Paul's letter, I think the principles of the uh, transmissional probability
Hmm.
would strongly argue that it originally occurred in the margin. So I think that's where it originally occurred. And if it was originally in the margin,
Mm.
assuming that it's was when Paul wrote his letters, he often said, "See with what large hand I give my final greeting." So he did not actually write, he did not actually pen his letters, and most of his letters actually name the secretary
Hmm.
who did pen that letter. So, for instance, in Second Timothy, Paul says, only Luke is with me. Well, who then could have penned the letter? Well, only Luke. And in fact, if you take the distinctive terminology of the pastoral epistles, you'll find that 65% of the words that occur in no other part of the New Testament, except Paul's letters, are distinctly Pauline. But about 35% are only found elsewhere in Luke's writing, Luke or Acts. So Luke is the second strongest influence on the vocabulary. Consequently, Luke, being the trusted scribe, would be actually penning the letters. And that explains the Lucan vocabulary and some stylistic features. But the primary distinctiveness is by Paul. So when Paul says, "You would have plucked out your eyes for me," I think that suggests that the physical weakness he had that caused him to write such large letters was probably a weakness in eyesight. And so when Paul writes, when he writes a letter and his secretary is taking it, and as they discuss it, if the secretary says, "Well, what about this reference by one of Paul's sources, maybe the House of Chloe, says that there's somebody there who is claiming to be a prophet and saying women should be silent in the churches," then I can imagine Luke writing in the margin the next to the words in 1337 and 36 that if anyone thinks he is a prophet or spiritual, let him know that I am giving you the word of the Lord. And if someone claims to have prophetic authority, well, right next to that would be a natural place to write the falsely claimed prophecy. So I can imagine that could be the case. And if that were the case, that would explain the two locations of the text in different manuscripts. It would avoid Pauline self-contradiction. It would avoid all the internal problems of it conflicting with what we know about Paul. So I think if it was in the original text, in this case viewed as a note in the margin written by the original scribe referring to a false prophecy in Corinth, then that could explain the text.
Interesting. That's very fascinating. Okay. Alrighty. And let's see here what else we have. All right. I know you mentioned this a good amount, but did you want to add anything else about, if this passage of 1 Corinthians 14, 34 to 35, if it actually is in the text, the original text, and it was written by Paul, did you want to add anything else about what you thought the original intention might have been if it was possibly in the original text?
Well, it's like asking if Josephus's text originally stated Jesus is the Christ,
Yeah.
then how do you explain this? Well, I don't think there is an explanation because it's so contradictory to what we know about Josephus. So what I think I would say is that if it were originally in the text, either after 33 or after 40, then the only explanation that would be consistent with Paul's teaching elsewhere would be if it is a quotation of Paul's
Okay.
opponents.
Hmm.
And then one could read 36 to 38 as a rebuttal response to that.
Hmm.
I don't think that that's likely to have happened
Right.
because it's not clearly introduced as such a quotation, but I think that's more likely than that Paul so directly contradicts himself.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right. And so this is something I've learned about in like popular thought, not any scholar that I've spoken with at least, but so I've been told at least, or I remember reading somewhere that some scholars have argued that in the early churches, the synagogues had men on one side of the pew and then women on the other side, and that's why Paul said for women not to talk because it was requiring them to yell across the room to ask for advice with their husbands. So, is there any evidence in Jewish synagogues or Christian temples or anywhere that would make this type of claim?
Well, my research has found no archaeological or inscriptional evidence that in the first century
Hmm.
uh, that there was a separate section of the synagogue or any other divider that separated men from women in a
Hmm.
synagogue.
Hmm.
Josephus records, quote, the decree of those of Halicarnassus that as many men and women of the Jews as are willing to do so
Hmm.
may celebrate their Sabbaths and perform their holy offices according to the Jewish laws and may make their synagogue at the seaside according to the custom of their forefathers. You see, the synagogue space itself that
Hmm.
has survived in archaeological expeditions uh, have benches along the exterior wall, stone benches along the exterior wall,
Hmm.
so that the participants would be facing each other from these benches. This highlighted the communal of their worship,
Hmm.
almost a democratic character to the space. Peter Richardson has argued that it's unlikely that the builders would have created a space that expressed the community's oneness and then subdivided it in such a way as to call that oneness into question.
Hmm.
Bernadette Bruton has identified women bearing titles such as archisynagogos, leader, elder, principal,
Hmm.
mother of the synagogue, priestess, and probably president in diaspora inscriptions from the second to the sixth centuries. Furthermore, the New Testament gives no indication that men and women in the early church were separated in
Hmm.
worship. After all, Mary sat at Jesus' feet, and you can't get any closer to Jesus than his feet. So she clearly was not separated. It's difficult to imagine how men and women could have been separated in a typical house church setting. Uh, Passages such as 1 Corinthians 14, you all prophesy,
Hmm.
uh, and everyone has a teaching, those kind of things,
Hmm.
and references in 1 Corinthians 11 to every woman who prays or prophesies gives no hint of a distinction regarding the location of men and women.
Hmm. Very, very fascinating. I appreciate the thorough analysis there. You could have just said no and we'd be happy, but no, I appreciate the extra info. All right, so last question on this topic, at least. Some have argued that Paul is trying to prevent disruptive chatter, that was happening in the church. Did you have any thoughts you wanted to add extra to what you've already said on that topic?
The people who suggest that suggest it out of a good intention, and that is to avoid contradiction in Paul. They recognize that there would be contradiction with chapter 11 and 14's affirmations of all prophesying. In order to avoid such a contradiction, it's essential that the verses prohibit only a specific type of speech, such as they propose. The problem is that they permit, these interpretations permit speech that verse 35 prohibits. Furthermore, if verse 35 prohibits only disruptive chapter, why does verse 35 prohibit something that is normally not disruptive, namely asking questions out of a desire to learn? This inherently admits that the person does not know the answer. So it's the opposite of judging prophecies. So again, Paul is not prohibiting only the questioning of prophecy. So in verse 34, since verse 34 permits speech that verse 35 prohibits. So it's self-contradictory. I would say that the passage is brutally clear, and we should accept it for what it says and not try to make it, to tame it, make it more manageable. It is because people have tried to make it reasonable that they have persisted in saying, you see, Paul doesn't want disruptive speech. And it's true, Paul doesn't want disruptive speech. But if you interpret the prohibition as being only disruptive speech, you set the stage for assuming Paul must have written it. And that's the question. We need to face the question and answer it as honestly as we can.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so that's the last question I have on you on this topic. So in our emails together, you said that to talk as long as you want. So I don't know if you're still okay with that. It's been about over 2 hours. So are you okay with you keep going? Okay. Alrighty.
You can split it up however you want.
Awesome. All right. I much appreciated. I'm sure my audience will be really excited about that. Alrighty. So let's see here. All right. So 1 Peter 3 is what we're talking about. Surprise everybody. All right. So we're gonna split this up, but anyway.